Good evening. I'm Akanksha Rastogi, Senior Curator, Programming and Exhibitions at the Kiran Nadar Museum of Art. A very warm welcome to everyone joining us today for this series of lectures we've been organizing under our program Researchers Practice. For those who are joining us today, I want to mention that we initiated this series in 2021, last year, with the intention of inviting scholars, curators, and creative practitioners to explore different aspects of research and creative disciplines vis-a-vis their own practices, and to understand research itself as a method to navigate and articulate the world around us. And within this research paradigm, where does the work of art lie? And so this is a forum conceived to publicly discuss and address such questions related to practice and research with peers and all interested participants. And we have had some really inspiring speakers who were self-reflexive and who very generously opened up their practices, methodologies, and their toolkits, the tools they use, and while they're also acknowledging their subjectivity and positions. And you can visit our YouTube channel to listen to all these past sessions. We are very grateful for this tremendous response the series is receiving and the soaring interest in hearing experiences from the field work and articulations of practice-led researchers and scholars. And in that regard, the last two sessions, particularly with Sankalpa and Shahid Salim, who are both architects and pedagogues themselves, were very special in the way they have drawn our attention to making, and in such remarkable way laying out what all constitutes knowledge, when it comes to makers and making. Both lectures oriented us so beautifully to think of research not as something which is only in which only the intellect or the mind is involved, but something in which the entire body and being, the whole person with feelings, emotions, and much more are involved, and where the real life struggles, conflicts happen and are resolved and are worked upon through making. Today is the third lecture from the set of 6 sessions conceptualized by Annapurna Garimella, which she has very aptly titled as Crafting Thought. And with each lecture, we go deeper into the nuances of research, representation, translation, and also into the questions and challenges that surface when practitioners craft theories from their own practices and articulate their positions and viewpoints that are also in the process of making. So we're thrilled to have Annapurna Mamidipudi with us delivering today's lecture titled, What Does the Weaver Know When She Knows to Weave? And through her zigzag journeys, she's been collecting fabrics, friends, and fables. She's joining us from Berlin. A big welcome to both of you, and thank you for responding so warmly to KNMA's invitation. And it is a real privilege to host you here. So I would like to pass it on to Annapurna Garimella, to introduce Annapurna Mamidipudi, and what drew you to her practice. So please kindly lead us into the evening, Annapurna AG.
Good evening to all of you. Good morning, wherever you are. Let me turn off these notifications. Yeah. So I want to just thank everybody for attending this evening or wherever else you're come, whether it's morning or afternoon. It's afternoon where Annapurna is. So just before I start the introduction, I should say that there are 2 Annapurnas today. So I am AG and she is AM. And when you direct your questions, you please, the questions can be posted in the chat. They can also be put into Q&A. They can also be directly asked, and you just have to raise your hand or tell us you want to ask a question, and we will do so. So there's no need to assume, or we need to be the only faces that ask questions. So let me begin by sharing a screen. So before I share the screen, I should probably say something about crafting thought. Each time I've I've made each lecture a bead to put on a necklace, I suppose. And for me, one of the great pleasures is to think about how to think about things. It's a pleasure. It's something that I spend a lot of time just idling, I think, like when I'm cooking or walking or listening to music. And an even more greater pleasure is to watch other people think and read their work and think about how they're thinking, as much as it is about that specific subject in which the thinking is happening. So as Akansha already summarized, the previous two lectures by Sankalpa and by Shahid, for me were particularly important for two reasons. And here's maybe the first time I'm articulating why I'm choosing the speakers that I'm choosing. So from Sankalpa is focused on materials and he's focused on the body. And I never met, except for one lecturer who's coming later, I've never met any of the lecturers. So I just was fascinated by their work or curious about it. So I decided to write to them, and so far they've kindly accepted. And Sankalpa's work was important to me because of his interest in materials. My own work has in part been on the material of clay, such an important and primary material, such an ideologically weighted material, such a core material for so many different kinds of practices, and also economics and different kinds of meanings that it's weighted with. Shahid was important to me because I work on contemporary religious architecture. But what I really liked about his work is that he's not afraid of his emotions. And he talked about diasporic longing, and longing is something that I'm deeply interested in. And the small presentation the short presentation I'm going to make, which leads up to Annapurna's presentation, and she'll get the larger portion of today's time, is in a sense a bridge between longing, nostalgia, and inquiry and learning. So this is how I think about things, and I often begin with where I'm at or where I've been. I'm very much a person who starts with something that has piqued my interest and is both familiar and unfamiliar and strange, not unfamiliar, but just strange or different. And I begin there. So let me begin by sharing my screen, and I hope I do this correctly. Okay, so I've called my short little presentation Thoughts on a Landscape of Innovation, or Tales of Innovation Told by Two Annapurnas. So when I was growing up, I grew up in Bhopal, that was Nehruvian India. My father was an engineer. And also I grew up in Konasima, which is now its own district, which was then part of East Godavari district. We all feel we're both Konasima and East Godavari, people in my family. So this is a landscape that's filled with water, and that's why I put in these two images, because coming from Madhya Bhopal to summers to my grandparents' house, you would cross over all these bridges across the Godavari, especially in Rajahmundry, and then you would go in a horse cart and sometimes a boat over canals to go to our village. And everywhere there was water, water, water. And I did not know until much, much later. There were questions there. Why is East Godavari district so different from, let's say, Madhya Pradesh, Bhopal? And I did not know till much later that Arthur Cotton, the British engineer, was so important to making this landscape the way I received it. So how did I receive it? Well, I received it as a landscape filled with canals, just filled. So every single line, if you can see my arrow, I come from this area. So this entire area in East Godavari district, now Konasima. Konasima means triangle, and it's a set of islands and water bodies and canals that he diverted water that was pouring out of the Godavari into the Bay of Bengal, into the landscape and inundated the landscape, which was iffy in terms of its sources of water. So this is just in the 19th century, right? But the way I received this is the way it's been forever. And then when you saw it, kind of felt like this, you know, this beautiful emerald green landscape full of coconut trees, jackfruit trees, rice everywhere. And another thing that I was very aware and that I've come to know much later is there were rice mills everywhere. And the rice mills had a particular form to them. That's what you see on top are rice mills. The way that I started thinking about rice mills was first through the cinema theaters. And I think it was the scholar S.V. Srinivas, the cinema studies scholar, who points out in his work, in his research, that the architecture of cinema theaters is based on rice mills, and rice mill owners were often the funders of cinema. So this is a very, it's a very beautiful way to know about a place that you think of home, to repeatedly lose it and then gain it, lose it and then gain it. It becomes estranged and then it becomes familiar. And in each moment, it grows. And below, I put the cover of this beautiful book that I read by Sujata Gidla called Ants Among Elephants, where she talks about how for Dalit communities who were working in Andhra, the cinema theater became an interesting place because nobody wanted to, there was no air conditioning. Nobody wanted to live next to the loud sound of the theater. So on the outside of cinema theaters, it was Dalit colonies that would become established. This theater is one of the oldest theaters that I've put the blue building. It's in Vizag, and appropriately it's called Pudna Theater. It was established in 1932. So when you go to East Godavari district, I lived in a village called Nedanuru, and I put it in here at the bottom. When you go throughout the East Godavari district, you don't just see rice. What you hear, so my grandparents lived in a very large old landlord's house. And it had a large, it's called a Manduva Savadi, a courtyard house with the pluvium, a place where rain came in. And we were children, and because of the caste makeup of the family, the bathroom was not close to the main house. So you would walk as a small child of 2 and 3 and 4, you would walk through the main house, and this house was at least a block long. It blocked the size of this village, Nedanuru. You would walk through the courtyard where it was open for drying mangoes and making papads. And then you'd walk through the courtyard, which had the well, and the garden, which had flowers for puja, and cotton, native cotton plant, which my grandmother collected the blooms from and taught me how to make wicks for the diyas with that cotton. You continued from there to the granaries, and then from there to where the cowshed, and then to the toilet. It was a very modern thing to install modern sanitation toilet, which was flushed. So the backside of the wall of this house, there was a street beyond the boundary wall. And in that street were weavers. And what I would hear when I was scared and in the toilet was the clacking sound of weaving early in the morning when things were being prepared. And it made me feel so secure and so comfortable. And what I think today is that I was comforted by the idea of a landscape of production. And it was a world that was producing itself right behind this wall. So when I circle all these places, these are compiled, all these circles are places where weaving happens. In my tiny village of Nedanuru, there are still today 20 weaving families, but the big areas are Pullettukuru and Bandarlanka and Ramchandrapuram and Kakinada and Rajahmundry. and Pratipadu and Peddapuram and Pitthapuram and Tuni and Chodavaram and so many other places, names which sound like a foreign country to many of you, very, very distant, but very intimate. So when we go to the next slide, so I always saw women weaving and involved in the weaving process. So it's been interesting for me as an adult and as a person researching into craft to realize that this is sometimes not so everywhere in India. And it's a radical change that's coming in, that came in with the modernization of weaving, the transformation of weaving as a gendered labor. Now, if you, today I live in Secunderabad, which is part of Hyderabad. And I went to a nursery near my neighborhood of Sainikpuri, and I asked Talpul Rao, the nurseryman, where he's from, and he said, I could understand his accent, that he came from East Godavari district, and he told me where he was from, which was very close to where my village is. And I said, oh, so that's interesting. And he said, yes, we are from a weaving family, and we've left weaving behind. I've left weaving behind. He didn't say we, I've left weaving behind, and I'm into this work because I'm not making enough money. So I started thinking about how this man entered into the nursery business and how he's innovating his own life. So this was a kind of innovation. This was a kind of innovation. And then this is a kind of innovation. I see all these as ways of innovation. Why did he enter plants and the nursery business? Because here, where you see, this is the area for Kadiyam. And Kadiyam is one of the largest nursery towns. It's in like 1,600 hectares or something of nursery plants. So all these plants, and the reason why, of course, it's there is because there's the Godavari. It says here, the Godavari. This is from Google Maps. And this water is plentiful, and all of this amazing land is being now turned into nurseries. And some weavers are going into the new business that's economically viable, which is nurseries. Another way I've been thinking about weaving and textiles is through a word that I grew up with called Bangal Dumpa, which is potato. Now, Bangal Dumpa is an odd word because in it you hear the word Bengal. And Dumpa means a root, and Bangala is actually Bengal in Telugu. So I became curious and I started exploring it. And I realized that doing a little bit of research as I got older, that the potato came to Andhra Pradesh, particularly to coastal Andhra, East Godavari district and elsewhere, from Bengal. And to Bengal, it came, of course, from the New World via Portuguese, bringing to the Gangetic Delta. So it came here and it's called Bangal Dumpa. So its origins are still there. And then I've been thinking also about this temple that I've been doing a lot of work on the Gangetic design work on ships that sail on the Ganga. And one of these ships is designed to travel all the way to Bangladesh. And this ship will pass a place called Puthia Rajbari. And in the Puthia Rajbari, there is this Pancha Ratna Shiva temple, among other temples. And this temple has the largest Shivalinga in Bangladesh. And the priest has told, I haven't been there, but the MD of the company that I worked for went there, and the priest at this temple told him that Rani Bhubanmayi Devi was a woman from Andhra, and she married Jagat Narayan Rai. And she built this temple between 1823 and 1830. And the lingam is made from basalt in Andhra, from Andhra. So this was really interesting for me. I just held on to it like a fact. And then I started thinking about my own family's deep interest in cotton saris. I've come from a sari wearing family. To me, it's still the most dress, the most comfortable dress. It's what I wear 80 to 90% of the time. And I started thinking about how did this world of Bengal in design and textiles, in other ways, travel? How did this traffic happen between Bengal, undivided Bengal, and East Godavari district and elsewhere? So I thought about the Bhadrachalam Canal, the Buckingham Canal that was built in the British era from Kakinada to Pondicherry. And now it's going to be National Waterway number 4, which is going to be opened up for traffic. So a lot of cotton and other goods were trafficked on this Buckingham Canal. And on the right side, I have an image from a Bangladeshi weaver weaving jamdani, and Upada weaver, Upada being jamdani, a place where jamdani is woven near Kakinada. You can see Kakinada up there. And then I also started thinking a little bit about other connections. Part of my family is Brahmo, and we have women in my family who are named after heroines in novels that were written in a Brahmo world of Bengal, women who are named Swarnalekha, and these kinds of very literary heroines' names were given to them. So then I poked around a bit, talking to my aunts and uncles in my maternal side of my family. And they told me that a chunk of my family was Brahmo. And they were also innovating. They didn't want to be Andhra Brahmins of a certain kind. They wanted to be Brahmos. So in the great textile place, Masulipatnam, also called Bandar in Andhra, the first Brahma Samaj Mandir was constructed in 1887 by Kandukuri Veeresalingam. And another kind of connection happened. And then I understood that Atmuri Lakshmana Narasimham wrote a kind of a tract, a lecture on caste, and published it, taking his Brahmo ideas and disseminating them throughout Andhra Pradesh. And I come back to Sujata Gidla's book, Ants Among Elephants, as I think about caste and textiles and a landscape, because these textiles, every village had textiles and weavers and a landscape that could support it, from water to moisture to buyers. And this is where Annapurna Mamidipudi's work has been really meaningful to me, as she's going to talk to us about the handloom ensemble. And finally, I would like to conclude this brief introduction to why I invited her by coming back to a place, I think, where as an adult, I feel most comfortable, which is thinking about the way that thread and textile are such powerful metaphors in the Indic world, from Tantra, Sutra, Dhaga, Dori, Tanavana, Kache Dhage. I don't need to go into all of this, but you will understand. Or how the thread is used to inaugurate whole life worlds, from the Janivaram Janoya Yagnopavitam to Raksha Bandhan to Mangal Sutra to the Mauli or Kalava that is used in pujas to tie it on the wrist, the chadar that's put on the Sufi's shrine, the kapade ke jhula, the sari that a woman wears in her wedding in Andhra, is then turned into the cloth swing for the baby, the first swing for the baby, the first baby that is born to that couple, and the kala dhaga that's used for mannat. And finally, one of the reasons why I came to Annapurna's work is because I've been deeply uncomfortable with, if I grew up in a world where I saw something alive and innovating, ideologically, I was constantly being asked to be challenged, because I grew up in the United States, and I'm not the only person. Many people go through this. You need to follow tradition. And I always try to understand, what does tradition mean, rather than react and fight it. My nature was to try to understand, what does tradition mean? Because I wasn't, and then as I became an art historian and working in crafts, the other word that I would hear is revival. We have to keep reviving. And nowadays I'm hearing this word innovation. And both revival, tradition, revival, and innovation have been co-opted and used by all different kinds of people. And to address this, I came across this poem that's also in Telugu, from a Telugu compilation that is in Sanskrit and a Sanskritized, Teluguized Sanskrit or a Sanskritized Telugu. And it's a beautiful poem, and I'm just going to read it out to you as a way of inaugurating the beautiful work that Annapurna Mamidipudi is doing. So this is from Velchur Narayan Rao and David Shulman's A Poem at the Right Moment. King Rav Vikramarka exiled from his city anyone who could not compose poetry. A weaver is said to have uttered this verse in response. I can make poems. I can't make them very good. If I work at it, I'll make them good. You're a conquering king. Your enemies surrender crowns at your feet. What then do you want from me? I can achieve poetry, weave, or leave. So I thank Annapurna Mamidipudi for, I think, pushing me a little bit to take on a more collaborative mode in today's lecture compared to the other ones. The next session will also be collaborative. So I request Annapurna to please share her presentation and start.
So, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's the lead up has been really nice talking to you, talking to Akanksha, and getting to know a little bit about why anybody would be interested in the backstory of the work that I do, because the front story is quite there. It's in the publications, it's in the work. So why would you need me to talk about, you know, how I got here? And it felt a bit self-important. And then Annapurna very kindly said, you know, you can make it about anything that you like. It doesn't have to be in a way that makes you uncomfortable or makes you feel. And when we were talking, she said, how did you get to where you got? And I said, I got there by being a good student. And she said, well, then just tell us about that. And I really like that, because I get to talk about my teachers, because if I have to talk about being a good student, then the thing that I can talk about is about the people who taught me. And it's a comfortable space, because when you're learning, failure is fine. You don't have to worry about success. You only have to worry about learning. And it is very clear that your teacher is a safe space for you to fail, because they really know you very well. And they don't set you tasks that are impossible, like the world will, but kindly and gently lead you along the way. So I'm going to tell my journey as a series of the teachers that I met, and I hope you enjoy getting to know them. So I will be talking about weavers, and the topic is, what does the weaver know when she knows how to weave? And I put up a picture of a woman who's actually not weaving, but who's winding the thread, because I want to talk about how the weaving world is, has been kind of limited to this idea of the weaver, and weaving never works like that. And actually no community ever works like that. No knowledge community ever works like that. So I wanted to put in a picture that shows how the woman is central to the loom, to the house, but she is also maybe not always the one who's behind the loom. So taking off from Annapurna's very beautiful pictures of East Godavari, my grandmother is from West Godavari, so I understand that longing for home. I don't think she ever lost it. She was from a tiny village. And she was the one who actually showed me a charkha first, telling me about Gandhi Garu, who came to the closest railway station, and how they all were weaving because he told them, spinning because he told them to spin. So that longing for home is something that I'm very familiar with. And via her, I longed for her home, even though it was actually never mine. My home was in Manipal, Udupi, Dakshina Kannada, which is also a very lush land filled with rivers and green landscapes, coconut trees, but it's also the land of a lot of temples. So we were very close to Udupi. Manipal is very close to Udupi. My parents were doctors in Manipal, but we used to run up and down the hill to Udupi. And so the first teacher that I would like to talk about is Parameshwar Bhatt. He was my music teacher. The interesting thing is that he taught us the Dasara Sahitya, which is Kanakadasa, Vadiraja, Purandaradasa, and he lived on the temple square. So, and the temple actually is interesting because you can only see the god, the little god Krishna, through a little window, and it's called Kanaka Nakindi. And the reason it's called that is because the story goes that Kanaka was of a lower caste and not allowed into the temple. So he was sitting outside and singing, and during the Maharati, the idol of Krishna turned away from the priests towards where Kanaka was sitting, and the wall broke so that Kanaka could see him. So after that, everybody can only look at Krishna through that little hole, that little window. So there was somewhere in that story already that the power of devotion and this idea of a kind of being equal before God was already part of how I grew up. There was also another opposition that didn't exist, and that was classical and folk, because the temples were full of Yakshagana music, performances. We used to stay up all the night watching those. And there was a lot of singing that was going on across both, and people singing across both genres. And my neighbor, Dr. Bhaskaran, was a dancer. So he would actually put on the thing and dance during the evenings. And in the morning, he would be wearing his stethoscope and going to work. And the other big opposition also that didn't exist was between faith and knowledge, because it didn't feel very different to learn a difficult piece of music from a teacher who believed in devotion, or to learn a difficult piece of mathematics from someone who believed in a rational, orderly world. So since it felt the same, and it's not just true for me, I think this would be true for all the people I grew up with, we pretty much didn't create that opposition between faith and knowledge. And the final thing was that there is a story that a biology teacher of mine told me, Indira teacher we used to call her. She told me in Tulu, and then translated it into Kannada for me, that this is the land of Parashurama. And he threw his implement onto the land, into the sea, and the sea receded to create land for him because he was wanting a place for a refuge. And when people followed him there, he said, in this land, there will never be so much wealth, more than 6, but you will never want less than 3. So this was a land always not of extremes, but of a kind of temperance. So going back to my teacher, I want to tell 2 stories about him. They made a huge impact on me. I mean, he taught me music, and that is a different whole other thing. But I remember that he told me a story. He said a senior gentleman came to him and said he wants to learn how to play the harmonium. My master also used to play the harmonium. And I believe he told him, I know I'll be very good at playing the harmonium. So my sir said, how do you know that? And this guy said, well, I'm a really good typist. So if I can type very well, I'm sure I can play the harmonium very well. And my music master was scratching his head and saying, there is a logic there, but I don't know how exactly it works. And it always tickled my mind, that story. And then there was another story he told me about how a Yakshagana Bhagavatar, who's very, very experienced in singing, for the crowds, for, 1,000 people, 2,000 people, throwing his voice out, came to him and said, I also want to learn classical music. And then he said, he would start off gentle and soft and singing. And he said, before you knew it, he had launched into that voice for 2,000 people. And he said, there was nothing I could do but just wait for him to, finish and get back. And I don't know why these stories made such an impact on me at that time, but I'll come back to them. There was a certain kind of tolerance to diversity, to difference, and a kindness in the way that he saw the world that I really learned from. He had a really terrible temper. He could throw things at you if you weren't singing, in Shruti, but he still exuded that world of absolute faith that did not need any kind of loud noise making in order to communicate itself. So that was my teacher from Manipal. After I did my engineering there, and then I moved to Hyderabad, where I met Uzrama, who introduced me to the world of craft and to the world of handloom weaving. And she had a way of teaching that was, anybody who knows her knows that she's an absolutely imperious teacher. She will tell you, you do this and you do it. That's it. So that's how she got me to learn natural dyes from a book. She said, yeah, you can learn it. Just pick up the recipes and you start doing it and you learn it. And I never questioned her. I never thought she could be wrong. So that's exactly what I did. And of course, you can't learn anything from a book. But luckily, the author of the book, K.V. Chandramouli, was also very much in our lives. And he was somebody that I learned natural dyeing from. And I think that was really, though I had done engineering before, that was really the first technical training that I received. How to make color from vegetable mineral sources. And I had to unlearn this idea of standardization, of replication, of the same predictability being the basis of knowledge, but actually having to deal constantly with different variables, different kinds of materials, different bodies of weavers. So this was something that was my first, between the two of them, this was the thing that I really, got to learn. Through them, I also got to meet Yellappa, who was the last indigo dyer of his time, and the person who, because of whom now indigo dyeing is being learned by other people, the fermentation vat. And the way in which I met him was very strange. I was in Uzrama's house and she was looking for him. And she knew that he was in this particular village and she was looking for somebody who could go there and look for him. And I knew that she had found someone. So I walked in and there was this man called Ramamurthy who was sitting there. And I said, hello. And he said, hello. And I said, who are you? And he had this gentle smiling face. And he said, I'm Ramamurthy. And I said, why are you here? He said, no, I've been sent off to hunt for Yellappa and I know that region a little bit, so I'm going. And I said, where do you live? And he said, in jail normally. And I said, but why are you in jail? He said, oh, they said I killed somebody. So, and it was so casual and that a normal that, and of course he had been framed and Uzrama had been helping him to, petition, but this man had the persistence to go and find Yellappa in that village. And Yellappa himself tells the story. He told me that story and toothlessly laughing. He said how I was working in a chemical factory. I had stopped dying almost 20 years ago. And I found that somebody had been asking for me, going from house to house. And then finally he got hold of me and he said, I'm not letting go of you. I'm taking you to Hyderabad to meet Uzrama. And he was laughing. And my task was to convince him to restart the VAT and to teach the weavers of Chennur how to restart the VAT. And he said, I won't do it. I said, but there are people who want to learn. So he said, okay, I'm going to test them. I'm going to see if they really want to learn. But I will even make that attempt only if you promise me that if you start the VAT, you won't let it die. Because each VAT is like a child. Now, again, these words stuck in my head and they kind of made me think. And, it sounds like he's being sentimental or metaphoric. But if you work in an indigo vat, you know exactly why you would refer to it like that. Because it's something that you have to feed, something that you have to train, something you have to take from, that you have to stimulate. And if you don't do all these things, that vat won't grow. So for him to call it a child was not to call it to create some kind of metaphoric or sentimental value to it, but actually try and explain what is the practice that needs to go into making something like this. So that was Yellappa. Now, there are many people I've met and many people I want to talk about, and I'm going to, even in the course of this talk, I'm going to leave some out because I'll just move on without remembering. But one person who taught me how to learn from Chandramouli Garu, who was a very tricky man, he wouldn't tell you everything he knew, was Jagada Rajappa. She knew how to give him a really nice meal and sit him down with a newspaper and coffee, and then take a little book and sit in front of him and say, yeah, but how did you do that? And how did you do this? And, that way of learning, in a way that where you make your teacher happy was something that I learned from her, from being a co-student with her. Of course, in my life, other things were happening. I got married, I had children. One of my, shall I say, difficult relationship with a teacher was my mother-in-law. I walked into a home from a place like Manipal, where it was just 3 of us girls with my parents, in a university town. We cycle everywhere. We didn't know, that girls were different from boys, or, we could do what we liked, we thought. And then I came into this household, which was huge. Every meal was at least 50 people. And I had to learn how to live in a community, a house that's a community, extremely generous, but extremely volatile in terms of because if you have to tolerate that many different kinds of people, then you really have to know how to be with them. And my mother-in-law was one of my biggest teachers of that. To tell you how she would teach me, I'd like to give 2 examples. One thing which I will never forget is that those days, even if you had a cook, you were doing all the cooking yourself. So if there was a festival and there were 50 people, then even if you started at 9 in the morning, by 12:30, 1 o'clock, the cooking was not done. And the guests would all pour in, and you knew they were hungry, and they were, already milling around the whole house. And she would say, Annapurna, go out, show your face, and say hello to everybody and come back, while we are frantically trying to finish. And I'd be in this state where I'd be running, chopping, cutting, frying. And she'd look at me and she'd say, when you go out, walk slowly. You can't look like you're in a rush. And I'd seen her do that so many times, rush about in the kitchen. But when she goes out, she'll look as if she has all the time in the world. She said, you can't look like you've been working. And this I learned so well from her that even today when I think I'm working really hard, people tell me, you don't look like you're working. And I wonder, is this a good thing that she taught me or a bad thing? But I know that it's something really valuable because it made me more self-aware. It made me aware of when I was rushing around, gritting my teeth, and when I was relaxed and able to just be. And those were things that you had to move between. The other thing that she taught me is how to take a sambar that's made for 10 people and serve, and a curry that's been made for 10 people and serve 35 people. So she would say, leave or the curd. So she would say, okay, let's turn the curd into buttermilk quickly because otherwise it won't be enough. And then she put it under the tap. And I'd turn the tap on and pour water in. And she would say, no, don't stand there. Take a walk and come back. That's how watery it has to become. And, somehow that, and then she would say, when I was going out to serve the vegetable, she would say, not that spoon, take a teaspoon. Then however many times someone asks you to serve, even if you serve them 4 times, you're only serving them 4 teaspoons. So there was something about creating plenty out of even a constrained situation that she taught me. And that I think is a very, very valuable lesson. My other, I won't call her teacher, but she unfortunately had to become one, is my daughter Radha. In 2008, 2010, after doing almost 2 decades of working in the NGO and setting up and working very hard with livelihoods, I began to despair, because I began to fear that this was like a treadmill that would just go on and on and on, and depending on very, very fickle funders and markets that were not really responding or understanding the value of what we were doing. And even weavers themselves saying, this is unsustainable and we won't do it. And I went into a very despairing, dark place. And I had to then find my way out, and I found it, through the PhD. But one way that and then because I went off to do a PhD, my organization, my colleagues felt that I'd abandoned them, and rightly so, because this was the work. Why are you going off to do a PhD now? And so I was cut off from the world of textiles, and I missed it terribly. But my daughter then did her arangetram. She did her dance performance, her first dance performance. And she and I would go and look at fabrics for costumes. And she would come to she treated and she continues to do that, and all my children do actually, to treat my closet, my clothes cupboard, like a library. So for them, they know each sari, they know its context, they know where it's made from, and they know its value. And in a way, that closet is their life story. And she made me see that. She made me see that I can't be cut away from the world of textiles. And that was such a beautiful experience. And it kind of made me less angry, because I was very, very angry with my colleagues and the weavers I was working with. I felt that they were not, I could not understand how weavers who had sent their children to America and wearing thick gold chains and done really well out of weaving, then saying, oh, weaving is nothing. And it really made me, so I was really, in an angry, dark place. And this was a very nice way in which I was able to gently, she led my hand back into the beauty and into the fact that it is integrally part of my life. It's not something I can cut out and say, I'm going to objectively look at it from a PhD point of view, and I'm going to treat it as a research object. So in that sense, Radha is my teacher. Now, The person who I went to do my PhD with is a Dutch professor called Wiebe Bijker. And he basically theorized the bicycle as technology. And it was a very, very strange kind of a theory, which said that the bicycle did not evolve by itself into better and better forms, but actually it was socially constructed by different kinds of groups who thought of it differently. So there was the manly bicycle, there was the heroic bicycle, there was the macho bicycle, there was also the suffragette bicycle, there was the racing bicycle, before it finally settled into this form that today we recognize as a stable form of a bicycle. And how these different iterations of bicycles were actually produced by different social groups who wanted that technology to do what they wanted it to do. And then he made me see that through that thing that, I'd always thought that in places like the global south, where we still have these kinds of technologies, we have crafts, we have weaving, I'd always been told it's because of our impoverishment that we have them, that it's our lack of progress that we have them. But if there is no such thing as a technological progress that is a pre-given idea, if every progress is something that society has chosen for itself, then it made me realize that we as Indians have chosen to keep handloom weaving alive. Maybe not, we have not kept our weavers in palaces and thrones, but we have, to the extent that 10% of the domestic market buys is of handloom, even if it's copied, and I know these statistics are much debated, but still we know that weaving is something that has been supported by us, not by NGOs, not by development work, not because they're charity cases, but because we value them and we value what they make. Whether we are able to communicate that value back to weavers or not. And that then made me get a chip off my shoulder of saying, we have to save weavers, and start thinking about how have weavers saved themselves? How have they managed to sustain themselves in this journey to modernity, which actually thinks very much in this idea of progress, which actually thinks that today you think that the jacquard loom or the most modern loom is a better way to weave than if you have the basic loom that is actually the most flexible piece of tool that a weaver can have to make complex fabric. Now, I don't want to skim over my journey from being a practitioner to going into a PhD program as if it happened through some kind of magic. A lot of people helped me, and I got a lot of help, and I was very lucky. People who had seen me write a good project proposal were willing to say, okay, she knows how to write. And that was my professor. He had been on the advisory board of my organization. He'd seen me work on 30-page proposals. So he knew that I was capable of structured thought. He knew I could write. He'd seen my field notes. So he knew I could actually produce work. My colleague Simantini Niranjana, who actually died of cancer by the time I went into, who used to pay attention to what I said and gave me the confidence. And before that, Radhika Gajjala, my own aunt, who said what you're saying is valuable. So that when I eventually went into the research space, I did not go there as someone who was disempowered, but who went there as someone who felt I have something to say and I want to learn how to say it. And this is why I'm here. And my supervisor also said, this is an excellent way to reflect on what it is that you want to say and to learn how to say it. And so I kind of hung on to that. But the actual decision was made when I was sitting weeping tears of self-pity in my sister's house at the age of 40, asking myself, what have I achieved? Weaving. I've not been able to save handloom weaving. And if I have not done that, then what have I done with 20 years of my life? And I'm weeping and making a big drama. And she said, she looked at me and she said, is there, what would you like to do now? Never mind what you. So I said, I don't know. I have no clue. She said, okay, let's try and think about it. She said, when you think of a happy place, what do you see? So I said, I'm sitting somewhere very far away from anybody that I know who's going to ask me to make them a cup of tea, or I'm sitting very far away from there. So she said, good, go on. And then I said, there's a pile of books by me that I really want to read. And I meant junk books, because I used to read a lot of science fiction, romance, fantasy. So I said, I have this pile of books I want to read. And this was before Kindle, so the pile had to be there. She said, what else? I said, I think it's a cafe and I'm drinking coffee. She said, fantastic. I know what you want to do. So I said, what? She said, you want to do a PhD. And I said, really? And she said, yeah, really. So I said, okay, then I'll do a PhD. Didn't realize she'd pulled a fast one on me till I was well into the third year. But this was the kind of help that I got to kind of, where everybody contributed their bit to try help me find my way. And I stayed with my professor's daughter in her house. I would go and just stay in her house because I didn't know anybody in the Netherlands, and I couldn't go and be by myself. I'd never been by myself. I was 40 years old. Professor Kiran, who, when I walked into her research master's classroom, and I thought I'd been the boss of 200 people. So I walked in and I thought every time I raised my hand, she would let me talk. And she said, no, you can't. You're in a classroom. You wait for your chance. And I was shocked every time she did that. But it was so good for me because I learned finally learned how to listen. And it is with that skill that I went back. I could go back to Weavers. And there I still remember the person that I met, Manam Viswanath, one of the Weavers, who had, so I was going back to study sustainability in weaving and unsustainability. So I had asked Krishna Ragaru from the Ponduru Cooperative to introduce me to someone who had failed at weaving. And he took me to this house where we were sitting, and this man was sitting there. And later I realized it was not even his own home, because he didn't have a home, but he was sitting there. And because he knew I had come to him and I needed something from him, he said, ask me what you want. I'll tell you whatever you want. I'll give you whatever you want. Just ask me. And that was another life-changing moment for me, because I realized that I have so much to be given in this field, in this way. I don't have to think about resources in the very narrow, constricted livelihood way that I'd been thinking. It didn't mean that those things didn't matter, but there was so much dignity and self-respect in this conversation when we were talking about what he knew rather than what he earned. And I think that was the moment when I realized that I don't anymore want to talk to weavers about what they do as a means of livelihood and their products as something that has to sell in the market. I want to talk about value, and I want to talk about the value of what they know. And that was how I further went into, then I got to meet other, so then I had to talk about innovation, and I had to talk about, somebody's raised a hand. Should I respond now or wait?
No, I think we can wait. I know Vidya, so we'll ask her to raise the first question.
Okay, great. So I had to go into things like, theories of innovation, which didn't work for us. Because the weavers themselves. So, and I did it in a place in East Godavari, which Annapurna was already talking about, Uppada. And I have a whole paper and I can send it to you. You can read it. You don't have to hear me talking about my theory of innovation, because it was absolute bunkum, because the weavers themselves would do this so-called innovation and then recast it as tradition. They'd say, oh, it's always been there. And they'd learn new technologies. They'd learn how to use mobile phones, computers, all kinds of things. But at the core, what they were producing was from their knowledge at the loom. So for them, it was not innovation, it was tradition. Now, here was a theory, and this is what it was not something that I encountered only in India, but in the Netherlands, from my other supervisor, Luke Box, who looked at me and said, "You've come up with a fine theory of innovation which fits into the Netherlands, but what does it tell me about the Indian scholar in you?" And I was horrified because I thought, that's my job. I've come here to come and fit into your theory. Now you're telling me that I have to not fit in and produce an Indian theory. How am I going to do this? So there were these two questions. One is theories that break down when they meet reality, as one of my young colleagues said, and theories that have to smell of the earth that they come from. And so in all of that, I could draw from the fact that I was working also on a project with farmers at that point, working on organic farming. I learned from Vedavalli Amma, who's a musician, and I learned from my family, who are all doctors, my sisters and my parents, who never separate theory and practice in the way they work. So from these kinds of frameworks, I drew the confidence to really move ahead beyond these kinds of theories that will take you into spaces that may not make sense to you. And then I encountered scholars who were also doing the same. So there was Pamela Smith, who was talking about the Making and Knowing project, and she was looking at 17th century alchemists, and she was reconstructing their knowledge and trying to figure out which part they called magic and which part they called science. There was Dagmar, who was looking at 17th century China and showing how it was actually the scholars who were writing the stories. So of course they wrote out the craftspeople. So you have to look at even the historical texts as being something that are partial, that have been written by people with vested interests, and to read between those lines to find out what craftspeople did and how they lived and how they ordered the world. And then I was lucky enough to go to Munich and each time I bumped into these programs because I was looking for something specific. And then I met Ellen and in the Deutsches Museum, who is a weaver herself. And her question was, when weaving ordered ancient knowledge and ancient societies, how is it that science is born and they lose their weaving so early? Where countries like us, which are supposed to be underdeveloped, we retain our sciences, our science in our knowledges, that is in our weaving, in our pottery, in our craft, in our material knowledge. How come we? So when people were asking her, but how was science born? She was curious about how did you all keep your weaving and how, and she could. So she came to Chirala and she saw this beautiful conference where weavers were talking to each other, and she said, yes, this is how it must have been in ancient Greece, and it is from this richness that science was born. But that science then went on to devalue weaving in a way that it killed weaving. So again, it made me see that there is something very resilient about our weaving communities that keeps them going. But that resilience is not just one of they're just hardy and they're no, there is something about the way that they've hung on to their knowledge and the fact that they do what they do in ways, for example, that there is no book that I have been able to find on weaving. They have not felt the need to write a book about weaving because they just do it. They have not fallen into this trap of thinking, oh, in order to prove that I have knowledge, I must write a book. They haven't. It's a trap I fell into, but the weavers didn't. So, in a sense, these all turned out to be moments of teaching and learning for me. I've really taken a much longer than I thought I would. So I'm going to kind of...
please continue. You have time. Please continue in a relaxed manner. Just like your mother-in-law told you.
Nice. Okay. So, okay, you got me there. So the thing is that, okay, I was looking at weaving as technology, then I looked at weaving as science. And then I thought, okay, finally, the question is, what is weaving when it is weaving? When it's not science, when it's not technology, when it's not culture. And how do you talk about it in a rational manner without losing its essence, without losing what it is? And here, you see the hand of the indigo dyer that is completely turned blue, and you can't separate that blue from that hand. And while when you look at it, it looks inseparable. Actually, what the weaver, why the dyer keeps his hand blue or her hand blue is because she then carries the smell of the vat to her nose. And that's how she can tell whether the dye is fast or not. Now, you can romanticize the hand of the dyer and say, oh, it's blue and it's the body of the dyer. Or you can understand that there is a technology there. And that's why that blue hand stays blue, because she's constantly using it to smell the vat. And that's why that blue is always blue. As long as her hand is blue, you know that the vat is healthy. And she's keeping contact with the vat and she knows what's happening in the vat. That shows that she's an expert, not because it's colored blue. Anybody can dip their hands into the vat and get it blue. That's not what's happening. But how do you learn to see this knowledge? How do you learn to not fall into the situation that, again, I fell into when I went to a very, very prominent museum and found that the sari hanging there on the museum wall was very similar to the sari I was wearing. And somebody asked me if they could take my picture. And I suddenly became the person hanging from the wall, the sari hanging on the wall, because you can't separate it. So is it identity? Is it caste? Is it my place? What is it that I have to interrogate when I say that my body is the site of knowledge? And not break it up into these different parts that I'm a woman, I am a dyer, I'm a scientist, I'm this, I'm that. How can I, theorize my location in a way that is not specific to me, but it's also me? And there I found things like tacit knowledge, which is what people use to talk about this knowledge, absolutely inadequate. And the Kannada poets who say Dehave Degula, which is my body is the temple. This resonated. This was the language of Kabir. We've from our organization, people have made a very beautiful film that I'd like to share with you. I will send you the link if anybody would like it, where you begin to look at these wordsmiths who were also weavers and craftspeople and who were also wordsmiths and could play between the two worlds to not create linear text or historical text or spiritual text, but actually make epistemic claims through words, even though they wouldn't talk about weaving, but they were weaving. So that was very powerful. But to get there, again, I had to go through ancient Greece. I had to go through someone who had done that thinking, had done that reflecting through her own practice. My boss at Munich at Deutsches Museum, Ellen. And one of the story that she tells is about a Socratean dialogue written by Plato in something 300 or 800, between 300 and 800 BC, where Socrates basically called the Meno slave, the story of the Meno slave. And it's a conversation between Meno and Socrates that Plato has written. And he says, how do you get to know something which you don't know? How do you learn, basically? And what he is trying to say is that you go from a place of not knowing to a place of knowing. And how does this happen? And of course, you'll have to read the entire dialogue that actually they were talking about something very abstract like virtue. How does one know virtue? And the question was, he says, can you speak to me of virtue? And then this conversation happens, which I'm about to relate. So Socrates draws a square on the ground, and he calls the slave boy and he says, can you double the area of the square? And the boy then extends the line along the horizontal and the vertical, doubles it, and completes the square. But then he can see that it is 4 times. It's not double, it's 4 times the square. That's the first picture that you see. And then he says, okay, this doesn't work. So then he says, what if I make it 1.5 times? And then maybe it will be double. So he makes it 1.5 times and he draws the square. But it's 9 and double would be 8. So it still doesn't work. So at that point, what Socrates does is he draws a diagonal along the square. If you can follow my arrow, this is the diagonal that he draws across the square. And actually it's a diagonal on this square because this is the one that has to be doubled. And the minute he draws this diagonal, the boy immediately sees how he can double it. And he draws a square on the diagonal. And that's this rhombus. Can you still hear me?
Can hear you. We can hear you.
Yeah. So now this rhombus is something that is seen in weaving a lot. It's the sign of Athena. Now, what is interesting here for me when I hear Ellen tell me this story is that she says that line is actually, if you use the Pythagorean theorem and you take the side as 1, then that diagonal is an irrational number. It's the square root of 2. That means it can't be grasped rationally. So for the ancient Greeks, it could not be grasped rationally because for them, all numbers were ratio. They all were in relation to each other. So for them, that diagonal was irrational. But it was extremely easy to grasp in the geometry. It was just the line between those two. So what was not graspable in arithmetic was extremely graspable in geometry. It was not graspable in arithmetic, so it was not logos. It was not measurable. It was a logos. And logos is also the word for speech. So you could not speak that number, but it didn't mean that it could not be grasped, because in geometry, it could be grasped very easily. And in threads on the loom, it could be grasped very easily. So this idea that you had to speak something, that you had to explicate something, that you had to tell something in order that it has to be rational and known, was already something that the ancient Greeks understood was not true. It was not logos versus a logos. It is not explicit versus tacit. It was logos and a logos together. That showed you that there is rationality, but the rationality is always divine, because the possibility of the irrationality is always there, but it is graspable. So this is the very interesting kind of way of thinking about causality, prediction that I learned from Ellen. And there was another moment where this got communicated to me. Now, if you remember earlier, I had put up a picture of farmers talking, in my farming project, in the project that I had done on farming. And here you see weavers talking. Now, I'd like to tell both those stories, and I'm really going to stop with that because I want to have more time to talk to everyone. We had the project was to find out why farmers in Punjab were burning their rice straw and causing pollution to Delhi. So we had gone there to find an innovation to turn that waste rice straw into biogas so that the problem will be solved. When we went to do the research, we found that the problem was so locked in because of the pesticide dealers, the fertilizers, the state government, that it almost seemed impossible to create a solution. And then we thought, okay, for whom is this not a problem? And we found that the newly emerging movement of organic farmers did not burn rice straw stubble because they did not follow that intensive kind of farming. So we organized a large meeting between organic farmers who didn't burn the rice straw and farmers who did burn, and said, let's see what we can learn from each other. And that for us was entirely not an ideological moment. It was not even an economic decision. It was what can we learn from each other. And in the beginning, the farmers were, the bigger farmers, the large farmers were very skeptical of the organic farmers because they said, this is nothing, this doesn't work. But as the meeting progressed, and it was on a farm, suddenly somebody would start talking about a particular technique, and people from some of the audience would come up a shout saying, mobile number, mobile number. And then that person would have to give their mobile number. Because it meant that they wanted to be in contact with you because you were saying something that was very important technically for them. And my professor Viba Biker was also part of that project, and he pointed out that moment as a moment of pedagogical importance, because that's when you recognized that what was happening was an exchange of knowledge. This was not just a call for a mobile number. It was a moment when you acknowledged that person as an expert. And that was a pedagogical moment. Now, a similar thing happened at Chirala at this large conference that we had organized in 2018, and where historians of technology, historians of science, anthropologists from all over the world, and resource people from all over India came, and there were 200-300 weavers who were coming and going, plus the whole village of Chirala that was coming and participating in the evenings. And there was this moment where a Laotian weaver was doing this extremely complex weaving. And one of the weavers from Chirala, Bandari Sai, he came and he sat there, watched him, and finally, without words, asked him, can you teach me? And he said, sure. And they both sat together, and that knowledge was transmitted between them. Now, when you look at them, there's a little film clip, as I said, look at them, you can clearly see that it's a pedagogical moment, but you can also clearly see that there are no words being expressed. So does that mean that there is no conceptual principle? Of course there is. Otherwise, such a complex thing could not have been translated, could not have been transmitted. But what was common was that both of them knew how the ordering of threads worked. The conceptual frame was in their head. And when you look at them and you look at what they're doing with their hands. So I come back to my music master whose student came and told him that, because I can type very well, I will be able to play the harmonium well. This idea that what we see and what we speak is what knowledge is. I think this is what we really have to question if we have to understand what weaving is as knowledge. So I'm going to stop here and see if anybody wants to ask any questions and move on from there. Thank you very much for giving me this chance to speak.
Thank you for such a wonderful presentation. I really want to thank you for making learning part of your ordinary daily life, and how you grasp lots of things. I'd like to, since we have, I already spoke quite a bit at the beginning, so I'd like to immediately open it up to the audience for questions. But to kick us off while they post questions, there's some comments here. But I'll wait for some questions to be raised. I'd like to ask for you, what did engineering give you?
It taught me how to walk into a room full of 72 or a room 72 of adolescent boys with raging hormones and not blink an eyelid. After that, I was always comfortable I didn't have the natural diffidence that a woman has in a male-dominated space. I just didn't have that. And that's why I could walk into weavers' worlds and talk to them, because strangely enough, the weavers I work with were all men, and they're very, very, hardened by life men, but it was never a problem for me to engage with them, because the other thing that it taught me is that is taught me is problem solving, actually. And I had to unlearn a lot of things, because Uzrama would tell me, just because you're so good at solving problems, don't turn everything into a problem. So I had to also learn.
The problem that engineers have is that everything needs to be engineered.
Yeah. So that was the unlearning I had to do, but it's still something that it gave me that first step into, kind of looking at something and trying to find a pattern and think in terms of finding patterns, and not separate things into this is the pattern and this is the chaos, but draw pattern from chaos and see how pattern can create chaos.
That's right. I'm also curious about what you learned from your NGO activism, and what's the difference between the various roles you've played in your own life, from being an engineer to an activist to a scholar. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I think that I'm not an activist.
No, I know that, but when you work,
even when I was in the NGO, there were people who were really doing activism. I want to say I did my job. I as I saw it wherever I was, and I was. But the thing is that I was not a very nice or kind person when I was in the NGO, and that's very strange, because you go there out of the kindness of your heart, because you want to volunteer and you want to do for people, and somehow I turned into this autocratic, self-important, overly responsible for the world person who had to save the world. And I think that is the burden of that place. I think that comes because you are handling problems far beyond your capability, either knowledge-wise or resource-wise. And you have to find your own way. And you have to disappear what you are doing alongside that. Because if you are a good NGO person, then you don't take credit. And so you set yourself against yourself in a way, when you're in, I found, at least, I'm not saying that NGOs don't do good work or that I didn't feel that I had done good work. I know that it was very, very valuable, the work that is being done by the NGOs. It's just that the problems that it brings became very visible to me towards then, and I felt that in a way it reflects the same problem that I myself had and the weaver had. That in a way what we know becomes invisible, but making it visible turns it against us, because that's what happens to the weaver. If he tells you what he's doing, it's copied immediately. I mean, there is no peer review law or norm that stops you from plagiarizing a weaver's pattern, because it's culture. It belongs to everybody. And what the NGO activist does is done from the kindness of their heart. So anybody can do it. Anybody can walk in and do it. It doesn't need any capability to run an NGO. So there is these very dualistic kinds of things that are set up, which was very useful for me to move away from and into research space. And as a researcher, I think I became very slow. The quickness of response that I had, the ability to respond, to a crisis actually came down, because I was always now beginning to second guess myself and think and say, wait, let's think about this. And it's a fire, there's nothing to think. So it's very good for me to have gone back now and live in both worlds, because I have people who tell me this is a fire, please don't think. And there are people who are thinking who tell me we are thinking here, don't turn this into a fire. So in that sense, I actually think that the best part of my world is that I'm able to live in all the worlds, and people tolerate me with my foibles in all the worlds.
You have a whole life. And that's one of the beauties of your talk, is that you spoke about having a whole life. So I'm very curious how all these parts function for you in your life, in your work, and how motherhood, being a daughter-in-law, being a music student, being a composer, you worked on an opera.
I was very much the person who was cheering and clapping. Other people did the work, but yeah, producer. I won't say composer.
Yeah. Okay. So you're a producer, and you're an academic, and your academic work is not a kind of straightforward, conventional kind of academic work. It moves deeply between field and lab. I use the word lab rather loosely. But field and lab, could you talk a little bit about that? So for example, I know you're with Timbuktu Collective in Rayalaseema, and that you were with farmers there in Punjab, and you're also moving in and out of Malka here in Hyderabad. Of course, moving in and out, meaning that you have to move to different places. And then you're also there in Berlin. And so can you talk a little bit about this dispersed geography of learning?
See, the thing is that every site has produced its conditions of possibilities and impossibilities. And I have felt sometimes that the impossibilities have loomed larger than the possibilities. But I've been lucky that I've not been in those spaces for very long. And here, since you talk about Timbuktu, I'd like to talk about something that Mary, who is one of the founders of Timbuktu, told me when I went to her, when I was in that deep, dark place of despair and feeling a failure. And I went to her and I said, how does one live with feel this feeling of failure? And she said, yes, Annapurna, it's really so hard. So I said, yeah, and when did you experience this and how did you get out of it? So she said, see, I'm a feminist. So I thought everything Bablu does, who's her husband, who's the co-founder, I can also do. So he leads, I can also lead. So I decided to become the leader of Timbuktu. She said, but the bus he drove had a single steering wheel and he sat at the steering wheel and that's how he led. She said, the bus I drove was a horizontal bus with 20 people with steering wheels. and we were all cheering. And she said, it didn't work. So she said, that style of leadership just didn't work for me. So I had to step back and accept that I had failed at that kind of leadership. And she said, then what I had to do, she said, I had to embrace my failure. So I said, yes. She said, and I did, Annapurna. So I said, yes. She said, for all of 1 hour. So if you ask me, I think that's one of the lessons, that of course you fail and of course you hurt people and of course you get hurt. But if you can find it funny, the minute I find something funny, I know I'm on the road to recovery. And it takes me a while to get there, but as I said, I've had a lot of help, and my children, my colleagues, and Vikram, my husband, he just turned into a mother when I left home. He runs the house now, so much so that if I try and, my mother's also there. So he is fighting with my mother over control over the kitchen, not me. So yeah, so this is, I just was I wouldn't have believed it if you told me that could happen. I wouldn't believe it. That 40-year-old wouldn't believe it. But the possibility was there.
Well, it is now 8:02, and we haven't had any questions. I would like you to receive all the comments. So thank you Rishika, thank you so much. It's been such a learning experience hearing from you. Yeah. Monisha Ahmed, hello Monisha. That was a fascinating presentation and sharing of your life. Thanks so much. Beautiful from Dinesh in Bangalore and Tumkur. And Rishika, can you please share the link of the documentary you were mentioning? So what we'll do is Annapurna M will send it to Akansha, and she will post it on the Kiran Nadar website and also on the YouTube channel and fix that.
So Annapurna, I just wanted to confirm if the film that you're referring to is Ulat Bansi.
Yes,
exactly. So I have the link right here. I'm posting it right now.
Excellent. Thank you.
So wonderful. Thank you so much.
Perfect.
All right. So everybody, please note that I am full of joy and gratitude, really, that we got to have this conversation. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did.
I did, but I'm just worried that I talked a lot and I didn't get to hear from other people. But I guess, so I'm basically saying that if anybody wants to be in
a problem where there isn't.
I know, but I would still like to turn it into an opportunity and say, if anybody would like to contact me or talk to me or talk to you and me together, and then, I'm open to it.
Please do that. Everybody knows how to, more or less, it's a good world for us to talk to each other. So thank you so much. And thank you for the team at Kiran Nadar, especially Akanksha and Abhijit and Priya. And also one more person.
Aditya.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all the audience who've taken time to be with us today. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.